I'm going to follow up the discussion of the historical evolution of the tank and armored fighting vehicles by looking at the evolution of anti-tank defenses during the Cold War in the cycle of innovation countermeasures that took place, in order to explain why weapons like the NLAW played such a prominent role in the opening stages of the Ukraine War.
Well, to begin with, as a caveat, getting accurate numbers is extremely difficult. I've consulted a number of fairly authoritative sources, but everything in these tables should be taken with a fairly strong grain of salt. These two tables show the armored vehicle holdings, both in active service and in reserve, of the Ukrainian and Russian armies in early 2022. I've organized them by main battle tanks, infantry fighting vehicles, armored recce, and armored personnel carriers. For both armies, they don't really report their anti-tank guided missile dedicated vehicles as separate numbers. They're a turret and assigned mission modification to their APCs and IFVs, so some unknown amount of those two categories would include the tow under armor type anti-tank guided missile vehicles. I've also categorized them according to their tier. Tier A vehicles are ones that were designed following the end of the Cold War. Tier B are late Cold War designs, mostly from the 80s. Tier C designs are from about the 70s, and D is older than that. Now, as you can see from these two tables, for active vehicles in early 2022, Russia tended to have about a 3-to-1 or 4-to-1 advantage over the Ukrainians. However, raw numbers rarely tell the whole story, and there are some important details that explain what happened in the first few months of the war. This is where I finally get to talk about the NLAW. Tanks, like any other piece of military technology, are subject to a cycle where an innovation is introduced that makes a weapon system vulnerable. Most of the time, there's a countermeasure that can be created for that new weapon system, and so the cycle continues. In very rare instances, there's no effective countermeasure, such as when mounted knights were unable to come up with a countermeasure to the halberd, in which case you have what's referred to as a revolution in military affairs. So at the beginning of this war, you had a lot of people claiming that there was a revolution in military affairs occurring where the tank had become obsolete. Well, to test that theory, let's look at the innovation countermeasure cycle within tank development since about the Vietnam War. In the 1970s, there were a number of improvements to tank cannons, both in terms of higher velocity guns, but more importantly, because of new types of ammunition. Two examples of the new ammunition types would include sabot, where the tank cannon fires a dart made out of super hard material, and high explosive squash head, or HESH. High explosive squash head makes bits of the inside of the tank break off into little pieces and bounce around at about the speed of sound, wounding the crew. The countermeasure to this was better armor. Up until now, tank armor had basically been steel that's face-hardened and of a certain thickness. The armor used in the next generation of tanks, which includes Challenger 1, Leopard 2, the T-80, and the Abrams, had several laminated layers of different materials. Exactly what kind and how is all still classified, but it's referred to as composite armor or laminated armor or sometimes chobham armor. These tank cannon improvements made obsolete the Tier C and D tanks. Examples of these would be the T-54, T-62, the Chieftain, and the Patton. In the 1980s, you had the next generation of shaped charge anti-tank guided missiles. These took a very old concept, it had been used during World War II extensively, where you have a directional explosive that creates a sort of jet-shaped spear of high pressure and extremely hot gases that pierce a hole into a tank. But this next generation had been increased in power enough so that it could defeat composite armor. The countermeasure in this case was reactive armor. Reactive armor is a small piece of explosive that's on the outside of the tank. When it detects an incoming missile, it explodes in a way that prematurely detonates the shaped charge. Reactive armor could be fitted onto most tanks through upgrade kits. In the 1990s, you had two innovations, the first being top attack and the second being fire and forget. The weakest part of the armor of a tank is usually the roof. Top attack rounds would have a guidance system that flies as if it's going to pass several feet above the tank, and then at the last minute dives down hard in order to hit the roof rather than the front. Because this required a smart weapon, that is, the missile itself knows where the tank is and can do its own guidance, These top attack systems tend to be fire and forget. The operator gets a lock on the tank, fires the missile, and then their role is over. They can run away. This is as opposed to something like a tow system where you need to guide the missile in. This is a very important advantage because as soon as you fire the missile, you're going to become the main target on the battlefield, and it's going to take several seconds for the missile to arrive at its target. A fire and forget system allows you to shoot and scoot.
The other innovation in this generation of anti-tank missiles was using a dual explosive charge in order to defeat reactive armor. In this diagram, they call it the forward charge and the main charge. In the next diagram, it's called the precursor charge. But in both cases, there's a smaller charge that detonates in order to trigger the reactive armor, so that this defensive system is depleted prior to the main charge detonating. There are ways around this, including some new types of reactive armor that detonate from the side, but these aren't in common use yet.
The countermeasures to these 1990s innovations was mostly jamming the signal or an improved optic package with thermal and infrared imaging. This allows you to clearly see the infantry anti-tank team that has that fire and forget missile and engage them before they shoot the rocket. All of these systems are integrated into new tanks, but they can also be added to the Tier A and Tier B tanks through upgrade kits.
In order to understand why these 1990s era fire and forget missile systems were so important, you have to look at what it changed within the layered system of anti-tank defense and the countermeasures the tanks were able to deploy against those defenses. So to begin with, at beyond 5 kilometers, you have beyond line of sight weapons. This is part of what's called the deep battle that we've discussed before. This would include things like attack helicopters, combat air support, long-range artillery, and so forth. The tank's own deep battle assets would engage and suppress the enemy's air force, the enemy's long-range artillery, and so forth. And so there is something to deal with this deep battle threat, although it is outside of the capabilities and responsibilities of the tank commanders. At around 5 kilometers, you come under the range of medium anti-tank guided missile systems, such as, for instance, the tow under armor. These systems tend to have about 1 kilometer more range than tank cannons, so there is a sweet spot where they're able to engage tanks without being fired back on by the tanks themselves. However, outside of this sweet spot, tanks are able to see the large visual signature of smoke created by these missiles and fire at the launcher, knowing that their cannon round will land much sooner than the 20 or so seconds it takes for the missile to reach. Given that most of these medium anti-tank guided missile systems have to be controlled by the operator for their entire flight, all the tank has to do is rattle the operator enough with incoming fire that the missile misses. At about 3.5 kilometers, you get into the range where modern tanks are able to effectively fire on each other, and tanks are themselves an excellent anti-tank defense weapon. However, there's an obvious countermeasure, which is that you now have a classic tank-on-tank duel. Now, up to this point, all the anti-tank systems that we've been discussing have been held at the lowest at the company level, and mostly at the battalion level or higher. But once we hit about 1.6 kilometer, we enter the range of short-range anti-armor weapon heavy. These are the most effective anti-armor systems that tend to be held down at the platoon and in some cases even the squad level, meaning that on a battlefield, rather than being concentrated in key areas, you can expect to encounter them almost everywhere. Prior to the 1990s generation of fire and forget anti-tank missile systems, these SHRA heavy systems had a couple of major drawbacks. They also needed to be guided by the operator, and although you didn't have the 20 to 30 second flight times of the medium ATGM systems, there was a window where you would be able to engage the anti-tank team. And these systems operate at a range where you're able to suppress the anti-tank team using the coaxial mounted machine gun within the tank. Second of all, these systems did not have the dual charge capability that was able to defeat reactive armor. So while the SHRA heavy systems were distributed widely across the battlefield down to a low level, they're more likely to damage a tank than they were to destroy it. And there's still a countermeasure that could be used by the tanks themselves. At around 800 meters, you would come into the range of short-range anti-armor weapon medium systems. An example of this is the Carl Gustaf recoilless rifle. These are unguided systems that have a flight time of 1 to 2 seconds, so there's really nothing you can do once the weapon's been fired. However, outside of some Category C tanks, and even then it's iffy, these SHRA medium systems are only really effective against tanks if you get in a full flank shot, and are mostly used to damage tanks for SHRA medium systems by doing things like blowing off their tracks. So as a tank commander, you don't have much in the way of a countermeasure beyond keeping your distance, if you can, However, you know the likelihood of it actually destroying you is very low. Finally, at under about 200 meters, you come within range of the NLAW Light. Examples of this include the M72 and the RPG. These systems are usually carried all the way down to the squad level, and similar to the NLAW medium weapons, there isn't really a countermeasure, but they're also not particularly effective at destroying enemy tanks unless you're able to get in a rear or a flank shot. So their main impact on tank operations is to make sure that enemy tanks don't get within 200 meters. So prior to the introduction of these fire and forget missile systems, you have the deep battle operations, which are outside of the control of the tanks. They have a medium threat, but there is a countermeasure at a higher level. Provided you can get air superiority and win the counter battery fire of artillery, this shouldn't be much of a threat. There are then a number of company and higher level anti-tank defense systems, such as medium ATGMs, tanks, and the NLAW Heavy. All of these systems had a countermeasure available to the tanks themselves, either because it's a tank-on-tank duel, or because there's enough time where a missile is in flight to suppress the operator, with your own cannon and machine guns that are going to reach the operator a lot faster than the missile's going to reach you. You didn't have to worry about suppressing operators of anti-tank systems before they fire until you get within the NLAW medium and NLAW light range of under 800 meters and under 200 meters. However, the threat of your tank being destroyed by these systems was quite low, and also with proper coordination with the artillery and the infantry, you could ensure that you didn't close into this under 800 meter range until you had generally suppressed the enemy defensive position. So at every stage of approaching the enemy, tanks had vulnerabilities, but there was always a countermeasure to that vulnerability, which could overcome it through proper planning, proper resources, and well-trained crew operating in cooperation with the other arms. The Javelin is an example of a short-range anti-armor weapon, Heavy, that had the new fire and forget and dual charge systems. This meant that not only did the risk of destroying a tank from NLAW Heavy go from medium to high, you also now had to suppress the operator before the flight of the missile, because it's a fire and forget system. Similarly, the NLAW is an example of a NLAW medium fire and forget system, and it too has the dual charge system that made it go from a low threat to a high threat in terms of being able to destroy a tank. This made the task of closing from 1.6 kilometers down to about 200 meters to an enemy position go from one of the least risky portions of a tank's advance to one of the most risky portion of a tank's advance. The dual charge systems meant that the reactive armor was no longer effective, and the fire and forget system meant you had to suppress the operators before the flight started.
Now this means when you look at any nation's holding of main battle tanks, Tier A tanks are obviously still competitive. Tier B tanks may or may not be competitive depending on what upgrade packages they've received. Tier C and Tier D tanks will not be competitive on a modern battlefield where the enemy is equipped with top attack, fire and forget weapons. And this is where the numbers gap between Russia and Ukraine is actually a lot smaller than you'd expect. Ukraine started the war with about 750 main battle tanks that had composite armor and potentially had the various upgrade kits such as reactive armor, jamming, thermal, and IR imaging. Russia started the war with about 900. This is why the massive influx of NATO-supplied NLAWs and Javelins at the outset of the conflict was so important. It exploited what's probably one of the largest equipment weaknesses that the Russian army had. It's also a weapon system that doesn't require a lot of training or a lot of logistic infrastructure behind it. There seems to be relatively consistent agreement that since the first few months of the war, the Russian army is focused on putting more of these upgrade packages onto whatever vehicles it is that they're using in the conflict. This has reduced a large amount of the initial advantage the Ukrainian army had because of the influx of top attack capable fire and forget anti-tank weapons like the NLAW and the Javelin. What appears to have occurred then is simply another version of the innovation countermeasure cycle, with people pointing at the gap between the innovation and the countermeasure and claiming that this has made the tank obsolete. This has occurred many times before, as pointed out in the cold open to this video. However, besides the error of assuming that a new piece of technology makes the tank obsolete, there are two other errors that people keep making in terms of the use of tanks. Specifically, creating formations with too high of a ratio of tanks and not enough infantry, or assuming that tanks are not relevant within more complex terrain. For that, let's dig back into a bit of a history lesson. Early in World War II, the armored theorists had convinced armies to go with very tank-heavy units under the assumption that tanks had made infantry obsolete. The result was very high casualties due to concealed infantry anti-tank weapons.
The lesson that came out of this was that tank divisions should have a ratio of about 1 armored battalion to each infantry battalion, and overall your army shouldn't have more than 1 tank battalion per 3 infantry battalions.
In 1939, the British 1st Armored Division started with 9 tank battalions and 2 infantry battalions. The French 1st Armored Division had 4 tank and 1 infantry battalions. The 1939 Panzer Division had 4 tank and 3 infantry battalions. The Soviets had 8 tank and 3 infantry battalions within their divisional equivalent. Within these organizations, the average is about 4 tank battalions for every 1 infantry battalion. During Poland and the fall of France, it was discovered that the tanks with this sort of ratio were vulnerable to infantry with concealed anti-tank weapons, and that the rear echelon needed a lot more flank protection. As a result, by 1942, German panzer divisions had 2 armored battalions and 5 infantry battalions. The British had 3 armored battalions and 4 infantry battalions, and the Soviet Union had 6 armored battalions and 6 infantry battalions. Throughout the rest of the war, both the Soviet Union and the British discovered that even these ratios were not infantry heavy enough. The British in particular ran into a lot of problems in Northwest Europe in 1944 and 1945 because they attempted to use armored heavy forces, which required less manpower, to make up their manpower shortages this late in the war. This was particularly a problem with the proliferation of new infantry anti-tank weapons, such as the Panzerfaust and the bazooka, because this increased the vulnerability of tanks that didn't have proper infantry support. Almost the same dynamic played out during the 1973 Yom Kippur War. The Israelis had very tank-heavy formations, particularly at the beginning of the war, because those were the ones held at the highest readiness, whereas the various Arab countries had a number of new anti-tank guided missiles that wreaked havoc on the Israeli armored units. It wasn't until the armor started acting in a more conservative and restrained way with higher infantry support due to the call-up of reserves that the Israelis were able to turn the tide of that particular war. Arguably, a major lesson learned in the first couple of months of the Ukraine war by the Russian army was that their organization was also too tank-heavy, with not enough infantry for support. Time and time again, combat experience shows that the right ratio of tank units to infantry units is about 1 to 3. But militaries keep trying to change this rule of how combat works. We'll come back to why that is later. Another one of the major recurring mistakes is the idea that you don't need tanks in complex operations. What I mean by that is either operations in complex terrain, like the city or jungles, or operations that aren't simple near-peer warfare, such as the global war on terror. In Burma during World War II, the British assumed they didn't need any tanks when fighting in the jungle. It did not go well, because the Japanese did bring tanks, and that was a major reason for their defeat. Similarly, the United States entered the Vietnam War under the assumption that tanks didn't have a use in the jungles of Vietnam. They quickly discovered that when fighting enemy Viet Cong who were operating out of bunkers and concealed by thick jungle, the kind of firepower that a tank could bring to bear was extremely useful. Similarly, during the global war on terror, there was an assumption that tanks didn't really have a role within counterinsurgency. As a rather famous example, shortly after 9/11, Canada looked at its tank stock, realized it was obsolete, but also that it was likely to be fighting counterinsurgency warfare for the next while. They made the decision not to buy new tanks, but instead to buy assault guns, as they felt these would be the only kind that were useful within counterinsurgency. Then we sent a unit to Kandahar and discovered how wrong that assumption really was. The somewhat obsolete Leopard 1 tanks were pulled out of storage, and in some cases actually pulled off of gate guard museum pedestals in order to cobble together an armored company to support the battle group in Afghanistan. In all of these cases, there was an assumption that in complex terrain or complex operations, you didn't need tanks. What was discovered is that tanks were worth all of the difficulties of operating them under these circumstances because of the firepower advantage that they provided. You don't need as many tanks in complex terrain or operations as you do in more open warfare, but you do need some. There are a few other historical examples worth mentioning in terms of the fallacy that a new piece of technology has made the tank obsolete. After World War II, it was assumed that because of the atom bomb, tanks weren't needed. Then during the Korean War in 1949, a UN force was nearly overrun by a tank-heavy invading North Vietnamese army. Many people took the lesson from the 1964 war in the Middle East and the Gulf War that air superiority had made the tank irrelevant. But both of those statements ignore that neither of those wars ended or had anything particularly achieved until an armored force was used to take ground away from the enemy. So why do these same mistakes keep getting made? Well, to begin with, the easiest one to understand is the allure of new technology. Everyone always thinks that a new superweapon is going to change everything. It seldom does. But there's a very essential human attraction to the shiny new object. It's also understandable why armies keep trying to get rid of tanks. They're very expensive, both financially, because they cost several $1,000,000 each, and logistically, because they take up fuel and spares and support personnel to an incredible amount. But why then do armies keep trying to use tank-heavy formations? That is, violate the 1-to-3 ratio of tanks to infantry. The Soviet Union and later Russia have been some of the key repeat offenders when it comes to putting too many tanks in their order of battle. Now, it's an awful lot of speculation to guess which units Russia used to invade Ukraine in February of 2022, but the best guess was that they used 3 armored divisions and 6 divisions that were either airborne or motor rifle. On this assumption, the invasion force would have been about 33 armored battalions and 51 mechanized infantry battalions, which is less than half the ratio of tanks to infantry that historical experience has proven is ideal. One clue as to why they might continue to pursue this approach is that tank-heavy formations are cheaper in terms of lives. Let me explain. Within modern combat, infantry are the casualty magnets. In an interesting example of the Pareto principle, infantry tend to make up about 20% of a modern army and absorb about 80% of its casualties. For instance, during World War II, the United States Army had 22% of its troops overseas as infantry, but they suffered 80.3% of casualties. Put another way, for each year of the war, U.S. infantry suffered a casualty rate of about 26.4%, whereas U.S. forces overall who went overseas had a casualty rate of 9% over the course of the 4 years of the war the United States was involved in. Tanks also have a high casualty rate, but it is significantly lower than the infantry. During World War II, the U.S. Armored Branch was 1.4% of the Army and suffered 2.5% of the casualties. During the campaign in Northwest Europe after D-Day, by the way, was a high point of infantry anti-tank weapons being effective with minimal countermeasures, armored units suffered an annual casualty rate of 17.6%, so approximately 2/3 that of the infantry. This is because of one of the biggest myths of modern combat, namely, tanks are not death traps. During World War II, within the US Army, if a tank was destroyed, there were about 20% casualties to the crew. To break it down more particularly, casualties were about 26% if the tank burned, and about 16% if it didn't. This is the last war where we have a large data set, big enough to do statistical analysis, that's been declassified. However, we know that these casualty numbers are still fairly good, because you had almost identical numbers during the 1964 and 1973 wars in the Middle East, involving Israel. During World War II, the British and the Germans had roughly the same numbers. The Soviets had quite similar numbers, although their casualty rates within a tank were a bit higher due to some poor ergonomics for their escape hatches. Bear in mind that a casualty as well doesn't mean a fatality. Most casualties are wounded. That same World War II statistical analysis showed that for tank crews, 26% of casualties were fatal. This is higher than the 20% typically found within the infantry, but it has some rather interesting effects once you look at the way that tank units are structured. This is a graphic from a website I highly recommend called Battle Order, and it shows a Marine rifle platoon during World War II. It has 46 personnel, all of whom are infantry, within that group that's going to absorb 80% of the casualties during wartime. Within military operations, a unit is considered destroyed if it suffers about 30% casualties, or a 30% decrease in capability. Now for an infantry platoon, those are the same things. So if this rifle platoon is destroyed, then you'll end up with a total of 15 casualties out of the 46 pers. Given the 20% ratio of fatalities, that'll end up as 11 wounded and 4 killed. Now here's a graphic showing a tank platoon from the US Army during World War II. This unit is a lot smaller in terms of personnel, with only 26. There's also a very big difference between 30% casualties and a 30% loss of capability. If 2 of the 5 tanks are destroyed or significantly damaged, then the tank platoon is considered destroyed and needs to be pulled out of the front line to be reconstituted. However, given the statistical analysis, we would assume that when these 2 tanks are destroyed, each tank crew of 5 has 1 casualty and 4 members that escape unwounded from the tank. As about 26% of casualties are fatal, around half the time this will mean 1 wounded tank crewman and 1 killed, and the other half time, it will mean 2 wounded tank crewmen and none killed. So in terms of human life, a rifle platoon being destroyed is going to cost you 15 casualties, 4 of which are fatal. An armored platoon being destroyed is going to cause you 2 casualties, maybe 1 of which is fatal. This disparity in casualties has only gotten larger as tank crews have gotten smaller. Let's take as an example a comparison between a US armored company against a Russian pattern armored company. The US armored company has 14 tanks, which involves 56 pers. There are more tanks than the Russian company, and the tanks have a crew of 4. However, this company, which is made up of 3 platoons and a company headquarters, is by numbers only slightly larger than an infantry platoon. The Russian pattern of armored company has 10 tanks totaling 27 pers. There's slightly less tanks, and Russian designed tanks have a crew of 3 because they use an auto-loader rather than have a 4th crew member. We then compare it to an American mechanized infantry company. They have 14 IFVs and 1 APC. The various vehicle crews and people who have positions where they remain inside the armored vehicle make up about 50, and there's 98 dismounts, which is about 66%. That means even within the American infantry company, there's only 66% of that unit which are in that dismounted infantry category that absorbs 80% of the casualties. The Russian pattern of mechanized infantry company has 10 IFVs, 36 mounted personnel, and 46 dismounted personnel, which is about 56% of the company. In both cases, though, the number of personnel in an armored company is about 1/3 the number of personnel in an infantry company.
Let's look at how this plays out with a 2022 Russian Guards Armored Division. This contains 2 armored regiments, which are effectively the same size as a brigade, and 1 mechanized infantry regiment. Now for the tank regiment, let's assume that there's 20% losses in the vehicles and 40% in the dismounts. Overall, this means 30% of the capability has been destroyed, which means for staff work purposes, the 2 regiments have been destroyed. This would mean the regiment has lost 17 tanks, 14 infantry fighting vehicles, resulting in 105 wounded and 24 dead. If the mechanized infantry regiment takes the same losses in terms of vehicles and personnel, they would have lost 9 tanks, 25 infantry fighting vehicles, resulting in 272 wounded and 59 dead. Given this graphic, you can see the losses, particularly in personnel, are dramatically higher for mechanized infantry regiment than for the armored ones. This may explain why the siren song of replacing infantry with tanks reoccurs so often in military history. Now, while there's a stereotype of Eastern Europeans not caring about losses, the history of that is a lot less clear. Typically, the approach of sacrificing flesh instead of equipments coming out of Russia had more to do with a lack of equipment production capability compared to its other European opponents than an actual desire. In Russia's case, they began the war with literally thousands of excess tanks in storage left over from the Cold War. So why not start with tank-heavy forces? If it all goes horribly wrong, there wouldn't be as massive casualties as if they'd started with an infantry-heavy force. I hope this gives some perspective regarding the use of armored vehicles and anti-tank defenses at the operational level during the Ukraine war. We see that Russia started the war with an overwhelming superiority in every category except Category A tanks. This made them susceptible to the latest generation of anti-tank guided missiles with top attack and fire and forget capability. This meant small infantry teams could engage Russian main battle tanks at 1.6 to 200 meters without Russia having an effective counter-defensive strategy. This is a vulnerability that appears to have been minimized by upgrading optics by late 2022 into 2023. Therefore, the early war assumption that tanks were obsolete is just yet another example of assuming a new technology was a silver bullet, not realizing it was a step in the innovation reaction cycle. We also looked at 2 other historical trends in erroneously declaring the tank obsolete. First, there's the error of using too high a ratio of tanks to infantry. This was certainly an error that Russia fell prey to in February of 2022. It's an attractive error because the losses from tank-heavy formations are much lower than from infantry-heavy formations. Another error is assuming you don't need tanks in complex operations, like in cities, in jungles, or for counterinsurgency. This is an attractive error because the cost and the logistic burden of tank units is enormous. However, the outcome of trying to fight in complex terrain or counterinsurgency without tanks is always the same. You don't need many tanks, but you do need some. So this ends our 2-episode diversion into the world of tanks from an operational level. We'll be returning to a more direct analysis of the Ukrainian battlefield in the next episode, where we'll be looking at the various battles of Kharkov in this war to date. I'll see you in the next episode. And remember, if you want to see these episodes early, join the paid tier of my Substack.